Good morning, class, and welcome to Chapter 3.2, Solving Equations Using Multiplication and Division. It's very similar, I only have a couple slides on this video, but it's very similar to Chapter 3.1, in the fact that you use the inverse operation. So when it was addition, you use subtraction. When it was subtraction, you use addition to isolate the x. Remember, when you're solving an algebraic equation, your goal is to isolate the x so that it has a coefficient of a positive 1 in front of the x. So today, using multiplication and division. So dividing each side of an equation. So we can look at this and say negative 4x equals 1. And remember, negative 4 is the coefficient on this. So negative 4 times x equals 1. Remember, there's always a multiplication sign between those two terms right there. So to isolate the x, we have to use the inverse operation. So if it's multiplication, we're going to use division. So x equals 1 over negative 4. So these two cancel each other out. You have the x isolated. So that when we plug it back in, negative 4 times a negative 1/4 does equal 1. Remember, check it out. If you don't believe me, plug that into your calculator. Because we're multiplying the outside here by the numerator, so a negative times a negative. Remember, there's two negatives here. That's going to be a positive. So 4 over 4, which equals 1. And that is true. Okay, so again, make sure you're talking to yourself through the problem. Okay, so I would say negative 3 times x equals 2. So if it's multiplication, I use the inverse operation, divide by negative 3. So x equals 2 over negative 3, or negative 2/3, however you'd like to say it. Plug it back in to check your work. Okay, so we know negative 3 times 2 is negative 6 over a negative 3. Negative 6 divided by negative 3 equals 2. Okay, so it checks out. Okay, always check your work and go back. So multiplying each side of an equation. So again, read this to yourself. Read this problem to yourselves. X divided by 5 equals negative 30. So it's division. The problem is division, so the inverse operation would be multiplication. So you're going to multiply by 5 on both sides. These 5's cancel out to give me my variable alone isolated. So I get negative 150. So plug it back in. We know that negative 150 divided by 5 does equal negative 30. Checks out. So down here, x divided by 9 equals negative 25. Multiply by 9 to isolate the x. X equals negative 225. Okay, plug it back in, negative 225 divided by 9 equals negative 25. So going back here, okay, inverse operation, it's a multiplication problem, so you have to use division. Here's a division problem, so you have to use multiplication. And here we go. This is probably one of the most difficult parts, but I think you'll understand this because right here, multiply each side by a reciprocal. So we have a fraction in front of it, the variable, which we need to isolate. So to get rid of this fraction in one step, okay, because you could do this in a couple steps, and I'll show you. But to do it in one step, we're going to multiply it by negative 3 over 2. We're going to take the reciprocal. Remember, this 10's over 1. So these cancel each other out. That isolates my m. So I have negative, if you cross reduce, my answer is negative 15. Okay, if you don't cross reduce, you know you get negative 30 divided by 2, which equals negative 15 either way. Okay, plug it back in to check your work. 10 equals negative 2 over 3 times negative 15 over 1. You could cross reduce again if you want, or multiply across. So negative 2 times negative 15 is 30. 30 divided by 3 is 10. If you cross reduce, this turns into a 5, turns into a 1. So negative 2 times negative 5 equals a positive 10. So a couple different ways you could solve that. Again, we want to use the least amount of steps as possible. For example, okay, let's say you wanted to multiply. This is a two-step process. You have a fraction in front of the m. So we usually want to use the reciprocal to get rid of it. You could multiply this by 3, each side by 3, so these two cancel each other out. So you got 30 equals negative 2m. Divide by negative 2m. M equals negative 15. Okay, so you get the same solution here. Okay, but that's a two-step process. You're multiplying then dividing. Here you just take the reciprocal. Okay, it's a one-step process. But that's just so you can see it. So we have negative 7 over 8 m equals 14. So take the reciprocal. Negative 8 over 7. Cross reduce. M equals negative 16. So plug negative 16 back in, you get negative 7 over 8 times negative 16. I usually like to make it over 1 because you're going to cross reduce anyway. So cross reduce, so negative 7 times negative 2 is 14, so it checks out. Okay, so always plug your answer back in to double check your work. Okay, again, inverse operations, multiplication problem, use division. If it's a division problem, use multiplication. And if there's a fraction in front, try to get rid of that in one step by using the reciprocal. Okay, remember there's always multiple ways that you could solve a math problem, but in my opinion you want to use the least amount of steps. So multiply by reciprocal to get rid of the fraction to make sure we isolate that variable. And remember, we need a positive 1 as the coefficient on the variable to make sure it's isolated. There's no homework problems on this video because you're going to jump right into your homework right now. And if you have any questions, I will be available through email. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So I hope you have a wonderful day and take care.